the immediate issue was partly to do with how much faith we put in the extant climate science. And really what we want, as you've probably seen, to talk about in today's conversation is two things, two sort of linked issues. One is, as I've already alluded to, how much as climate activists we should go along with the best climate science as it is, or whether we should pull short of that or go further than that. And the second issue, which we must make sure that we get to as well, is kind of where do we go from here with climate activism generally in the context of the coronavirus crisis.
So Rupert has introduced this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the science first, Rupert, and express my concern about how some of the science is represented. And then perhaps if you'd like to come back on that, and then maybe we can move on to the activism. Does that sound okay?
Yeah. I definitely want to say some things about my attitude towards the science and so forth. So yeah.
Okay. So basically, my position is that in climate change, most of what we know, we only know because of the science. So when we talk about climate change means this, that, or the other, the vast majority of that is because we have studied or heard something of the science that leads us and the groups with which we are involved to think that way. And therefore, if we are going to be activists in whatever way, and there's many ways of being activists, you can be an activist in the obstructive sense of blockading a road, blockading a cruise ship, something like that. Or you can be an activist in the constructive sense of building community structures, having events like this. There are these many different ways of activism. And I'm sure that many of us here have been involved in all of these forms of activism. I've had my property arrested for non-payment of the poll tax, a community charge, principled non-payment when it came out. I've been arrested at the Fastlane nuclear base. I lost my job at Edinburgh University in 1996 because of my activism, etc. Many of you here today will have similar stories to tell of that kind of more obstructive form of activism. But there's also the constructive activism of how we build the base for what the future world might look like. And in whatever we do with either of those things, if it is about climate change, it has to be informed by the science of climate change. If we're going to be activists of whatever sort, and I consider climate scientists are also activists in the sense that they are active, they have engaged themselves in this form of witness in the world. If we're going to do that, what we do has to be based on the science. And the question then comes, if we are not professional climate change scientists who have built up reputations worth not losing, we have to look at the science and the science from people who have reputations worth not losing. So anybody can claim to be a climate change scientist, but whether they really are depends upon the reputation that they've built up. And this is why, for me, if we're going to engage in climate change activism, we have no mandate. Even somebody like myself with 3 degrees, including a sort of earth science, a general earth science BSc degree, I consider that I have no mandate to go beyond the established, the consensus expert peer-reviewed science. Where do you get that from? You get that from professional bodies like the Royal Society in Britain, the foremost scientific body there, or the parliamentary select committees that we have in the UK parliamentary system, or above all internationally from the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It therefore disturbs me when I move in activist circles. And in Scotland, I've been invited on a number of occasions to speak at XR events. But it does disturb me when I hear what I think of as being careless narratives that exceed the science. Narratives that say that we've only got 10 years to go before social collapse in most countries of the world, which a number of key global scientists think exaggerates the situation. Narratives that say that within 1 or 2 generations, 6 to 7 billion people in the world will be dead because of climate change, which again, leading climate scientists say there is no basis for that in the climate science. Narratives even, and I'm saying this at the moment without feeling the need to name any of those involved, but you will recognize the names, I'm sure, narratives that by the year 2026, human beings will be extinct. And these narratives concern me because not only do they go beyond the science, and in a context where we are talking about telling the truth about what is happening, by exceeding the consensus expert science, they undermine our own claim to truth. But also they set up a whole generation of younger activists who may not have the experience, who might listen to the voices that are saying these, people who they might admire, and will be setting them up for, you know, what happens when the apocalypse doesn't come. And there's been a lot of studies of that kind of thing. The whole area of cognitive dissonance studies, a famous book in 1954-55 called When Prophecy Fails by Leon Festinger, about how once people get set into these ways of thinking about apocalypse, it's very difficult to move the mind out of it because you invest so much in a false narrative that actually what Festinger found was that when the flying saucer cult didn't turn up to take them on a techno rapture, people in the cult, some people actually believed more strongly in a narrative than they did before, because they believed that their efforts, their prayers, or whatever it was, had offset the apocalypse. So my appeal, Rupert, is that I think that in some of the activist movement and amongst some key leaders in the movement, we have seen an exaggerated profile of the science, pushing the narrative of near-term human extinction. There's even a hashtag NTHE, complete with a number of suicide advisory sites for people who might feel suicidal as a result. We've seen these narratives of near-term human extinction. We've seen these narratives of imminent mass social collapse, not because of the coronavirus, which most experts would say has got probably nothing to do with climate change in terms of how that coronavirus came about, but specifically near-term collapse because of climate change. And you know, we hear figures sort of 6 to 7 billion dead this century, about 9/10 of the world's population collapsing this century. And I consider these narratives to be damaging in the movement, and it's something which we need to look at. So Rupert, could I pass over to you now for a response on that one?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So, look, let's establish some common ground immediately. The near-term human extinction stuff is just pure cult bullshit and garbage. And I wouldn't want to be seen for 1 second as defending any of that. A lot of what Alistair says sounds, by contrast with that kind of nonsense, incredibly reasonable and sensible. But I guess I would want to suggest that the reason it sounds so very reasonable, and perhaps to some of you sounds incredibly hard to object to, is that we live in a scientistic society. A scientistic society is a society which has an ideology which says that the only worthwhile kind of knowledge is science, and nothing else is real knowledge or really counts. And as a philosopher of science, I think that's a dangerous ideology. Alistair started off by saying something which sounds incredibly reasonable, which he said, look, most of what we know about the climate comes from science, so we ought to respect that. But even that, it seems to me, is not really true. We don't need any science at all to know that chucking lots of stuff into the atmosphere that hasn't been in the atmosphere before is probably not a very sensible thing to do. Or similarly, to know that eliminating many natural habitats is not a very sensible thing to do. And this is a sort of baseline precautionary attitude that I'm now putting forward, that I want to suggest to you comes before any scientific knowledge whatsoever, and actually provides most of what we need in order to understand that the way that we are living is kind of crazy. Of course, climate science and other forms of science are extremely valuable to back that up and go into all sorts of magnificent detail about it. And as a philosopher of science, I am completely in awe of the magnificence of the detailed beauty of most scientific accomplishments and scientific institutions, for that matter. And indeed, some of my best friends are climate scientists. They really are. I work alongside some of the world's leading climate scientists at the University of East Anglia. They're splendid people. Many of them have heroically withstood huge amounts of abuse from opinionated fools, climate denialists, etc. But again, as a philosopher of science, and I take it that that is a relevant expertise to this conversation, Alistair's sort of been trying to say, well, look, the only really relevant expertise is climate science. But I don't accept that. I think there are other forms of relevant expertise. As a philosopher of science, I need to tell you, in case it's not clear to you, and it's not clear to a lot of people, I think, in a scientific society, that science is inherently a conservative institution. Scientists always lean naturally onto the safe side in terms of not wanting to say more than they think they can prove. And that is an attitude which is splendid if you're wanting to construct something which is really, really solid. And the magnificent solidity of science as an edifice is testimony to that. But it's not so splendid if you come to areas where actually what is crucial is to be able to protect ourselves, protect the population, protect the future, etc., in a context where we may not have all the knowledge yet, in order to be able to cast iron guarantee that knowledge with the sort of scientific full stamp of approval. So science is a conservative institution, and that works well in all contexts, except the kind of context which we are in when we're in the context of, say, climate, or similarly, the coronavirus, and we could come back to that point. The Ipcc, which Alistair mentioned, is doubly conservative. The Ipcc takes the best science and it sifts it. It takes a long time to sift it. So the Ipcc is always out of date. Even when you get one of their new reports, it's always 1, 2, 3 years out of date. The Ipcc demands that every single thing in every single line of its reports gets absolutely nailed down. It does that because to try to resist the attacks, the opinionated attacks of climate scientists. And there's a place for that. And that's I can see the logic of that. But that, again, is not a sensible attitude if what you're trying to do is to act in a maximally protective way in relation to stuff where you may not have stuff that you can absolutely fully nail down. The Ipcc labels its knowledge, its answers, its statements as high confidence, medium confidence, or low confidence. And when people read in the Ipcc reports that something is low confidence, they're naturally going to think, oh, well, maybe that's not something too much to worry about then. And typically the things which are low confidence are actually the things which we should worry about the most. They're actually the most threatening things of all. They're things like the vicious feedbacks which we fear but are uncertain whether they're happening or how much they're happening. I could go on. Ipcc reports are summarized for policymakers and for the media and so on. And most people only read the summaries. And the summaries are edited by governments and civil servants. let me just pause for that to sink in. The information which most people actually get from the IPCC is edited by governments and civil servants. And believe you me, they do not edit it to make it more worrying and more prompting of full-scale action of the kind that many of us are in favor of. They always edit it in the opposite direction. You put all this together, and then it's not so surprising that when you have science as a conservative institution, and then the IPCC as a doubly conservative institution, it's not too surprising that, to give you a concrete example, the predictions for Arctic melt, which is an important feature of what's occurring in terms of the potential catastrophic feedbacks that we're subject to, what's actually happened in the last few years has exceeded the worst case scenarios under those predictions. And that's quite a concrete piece of evidence to suggest that it's not a sensible way for us to maximally protect ourselves to simply go along with what the science has proved and what the IPCC has concluded. Now, I don't make predictions. A few of my colleagues in Extinction Rebellion have sometimes made predictions about what's going to happen this century. I think that's a fool's game, and I completely agree with Alistair about that. But I do explore scenarios, and so do some of the world's greatest climate scientists and system scientists. People like Rockstrom and Schnellhuber are prepared to say now exactly the kinds of things that Alistair actually threw doubt on in his remarks a little while ago. They're prepared to say that we are at risk now, not predicting it's going to happen, but that we are at risk now of billions dying this century. That's not me who's saying that, but that's those top climate scientists and system scientists. And mentioning the word system brings me to another point of slight disagreement with Alistair. Alistair suggests that we should only listen to climate scientists in relation to thinking about prospects of societal collapse. But I think that's a mistake. We should also listen to generalists and system thinkers, because many climate scientists are actually not well placed to tell us anything very concrete about whether society is likely to collapse or not. Because the question of whether society is going to collapse or not is a far more complex and imponderable question than the question of what's happening to some part of the Arctic or what's happening to some part of the atmosphere, etc. To draw my remarks to a close, Alistair mentioned that scientists build their reputations through doing really solid work and being able to defend it well. And that is absolutely correct. And that can sometimes be exactly the problem, that scientists are typically cautious when it comes to their reputations. That's one of the main reasons why they don't want to make any claims that they can't absolutely nail down and absolutely back up. But that caution about their reputations of being able to defend what they say, and that unwillingness to be ever caught saying something which they can be found wrong in, means that they're not sometimes sufficiently cautious about our planet. And that is what the precautionary principle is all about. And that is at the heart of the attitude of Extinction Rebellion to these matters. What Extinction Rebellion says is not that if we don't go carbon net zero and biodiversity loss net zero by 2025, then society will collapse within 5 years or whatever. What Extinction Rebellion says is the sensible thing to do, the prudent thing to do, is to go carbon net zero and biodiversity loss net zero by 2025, because that's the precautious thing to do. So when you heard Alistair's remarks, you might have been thinking, well, what he says sounds very sensible. And I see that as a kind of way of playing safe, and sticking with the science is a way of playing safe. But when it comes to our planet, sticking narrowly to the science and not being willing to go beyond it in making society safe and in exercising precaution is not playing safe with our common future. And that's, I think, the main basis of the disagreement between us in that regard. Alistair, what do you think?
Laura, shall I proceed with some response to that?
Please.
I think, Rupert, the precautionary principle, the principle that you ought not do something where you don't have a good sense of what the consequences are going to be, Would that be a fair summary, or would you like to define it more specifically?
Yeah, that's
okay.
roughly right. Yeah.
That the precautionary principle, in which Rupert is a world-renowned expert, is very persuasive when looked at within narrow system boundaries. That, as he says, it makes sense that if you throw CO2 up into the atmosphere, that is not going to be a good thing to do. So the precautionary principle would say we should not be doing that. I completely agree with that until you look at the framing that it is held within, in which you have to ask, well, where is it that we are actually at now? And where we are actually at now is that because of the very high energy density of fossil fuels, we have been able to build a world of nearly 8 billion people whose supply systems are tightly interlocked on a just-in-time basis, the consequences of which the virus is now revealing to us.
Yeah.
However, as a number of commentators are warning, if we say, okay, well, the virus has taught us a good lesson about our economic fragility, now let's, after we've had virus lockdown, which, as I believe is the case, even with the reduction in emissions worldwide caused by the virus so far, it's still not giving us enough reduction to meet the 1.5 degree target. We need to do even more on climate change. The question is, how is that going to play out politically? And what are the trade-offs, Rupert, in the precautionary principle between, on the one hand, saying we know what we need to do, as Michael Mann puts it, climate science is quite alarming enough without needing to make it alarmist, without needing to exaggerate it further. We already know what we need to do. But if we exaggerate the situation to try and drive a political process, what are the dangers of eco-populism in that? What are the dangers that, as we have seen, whenever governments around the world try to impose fuel taxes, you get the truckers' protests or the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, all of that kind of thing. And you actually counterproductively sow the seeds for an authoritarian backlash.
Yeah. And that's a great question. And this is so hard, we're in such a, let's just remind ourselves the reason why we're here and the reason why we're having this disagreement at all. It's because we're in agreement that the situation is really dire, and whichever way you turn, there are difficulties, and I'm the first to accept that. But I guess what I would say on that specific point is actually it seems to me that the XR methodology shows a very hopeful way forward in relation to the Gilets jaunes type situation, because it's important to understand that the Gilets jaunes are by no means dominated by sort of Trumpian climate denialist know-nothings. Plenty of people in the Gilets jaunes are actually concerned about climate and ecology and so on. They're just more concerned about their immediate difficult living situation. And so they have this little slogan, you worry about the end of the world, we worry about the end of the month. They're waiting for their pay packet. And they would love, many of them, to have a solution be come up with which didn't put those two in conflict. And that is absolutely central to XR's ambitions. Yeah, we're incredibly ambitious in terms of the aim for getting us out of this emergency. But we're also very clear that we need to do so in a way which is just, that there has to be a just transition. And justice is built into the third demand of XR for a citizens' assembly. Now, in relation to the French situation, Macron has intriguingly pulled a leaf, to some extent at least, out of XR's book. Macron has created a climate assembly. And Macron has, I think, to some extent understood that actually the third demand of Extinction Rebellion for citizens' assemblies could be the smart politician's best friend. Because what politicians are worried about is fomenting fuel truck protests and Gilets jaunes type protests and so on. If they go too far of where the population is. What XR are trying to do is to move the Overton window so that actually the population are catching up, if you see what I mean, with where they need to be. But furthermore, what I think Macron has understood is that a citizens' assembly can give a smart politician cover for going further, because the politician doesn't have to lead. The politician can say, well, look, it's not me who's forcing you to pay more for your petrol or to take less flights or whatever. It's you, the citizens. This citizens' assembly sat, they debated, they deliberated, they came up with these really radical ideas. And the first ideas coming out is we're just getting in the last 24 hours, the first draft of the ideas coming out of the French Climate Assembly. And they look like they're really radical ideas, which are going to be able to help maybe move us in the direction we need to. So look, nothing is easy here. And I'm the first to admit that there is a risk with the XR approach that you do get a populist backlash. But I do think we can take a little bit of hope from this French experience so far, that actually maybe what we're doing, what we're calling for, is the best way of going forward for something really radical, which does not dictate a populist backlash, unlike what Macron did before in the first place, of course, which was to impose a regressive carbon tax.
Can I raise one more science point and then maybe move on to activism?
Mm-hmm.
You make the case, Rupert, that in climate change, that science is not the only way of knowing. And I counter that by saying that the view of science is that we have to be very careful of going on our intuitions on these matters, because until you actually measure things over the long term, you don't really know what is happening. And we discussed the other day the theory that has been put around recently that the coronavirus might be linked to climate change, because climate change, if I might sort of summarize, climate change has caused collapse in insect life. And insect life means that starving bats maybe leaving their normal migratory patterns and going elsewhere and spreading the virus. And so maybe we ended up with coronavirus because of climate change. Now, something like that intuitively sounds very plausible until you actually start to look at the science, because the first question you come to is, what is the actual evidence of insect collapse such as would affect bats, namely insect and specifically flying insect biomass, so the weight of flying insects? Now, I don't know, and Jem Bendel, who put out that particular theory, doesn't give evidence of any insect collapse in Wuhan province in China. But when I thought about that question, I thought, well, what is the evidence around bats and Britain? And I looked at the Rothamsted Insect Survey, which has recently published a paper in one of the Nature journals, in which the longest running study of insect collection sites is published. So they're looking at data going back 54 years. 50 years. For 50 years. They point out that most other studies are far shorter than that. The German one that claims an 80% collapse in insect only looks over the past 22 years or something like that. And what they show is that there is currently, if you compare the first decade of the 1960s, when they started their standardized monitoring, if you compare the first decade from 1967, I think it was, with the most recent decade ending 2017, if you compare that, there are actually 2.2 times as many, the weight of the biomass of moths in Britain than there were back then. And that this is reflected in the British bat insects, because bats eat things like moths, that there's been a 42% increase in the British bat insect, representing the abundance and diversity of bats in the UK, as I understand it, and according to the Bat Conservation Society. So I would put it to you that when non-scientists try to be experts in entomology or in oceanography or in atmospheric science, we can very easily be led astray by picking up on selected bits of the science, which, because they are dramatic, get profiled in the media, and we then form a false view of the reality that might be going on. And as the IPCC emphasizes in its 3 special reports, particularly the section in the special report on climate change and the land that came out about a year ago or so, as it emphasizes, there is a serious problem then with misattribution. That if we use the science wrongly and misattribute cause and effect, we then take the wrong decisions in coming to the remedies. Therefore, I put it to you that there is no excuse, there is no substitute for taking our science from expert panels of people who look at not only the Rosenstedt study, and not only the German study, and not only the Danish study of windscreen splats on cars, etc., but data from around the world, and balances up what is really happening and how that might affect something like the spread of coronaviruses in this case. I would put it to you that it is tempting to say, yes, there are many other ways of knowing and we should go by our feelings and what have you, and what I saw happening in my garden compared with when I was a boy, all of that kind of thing. But the evidence suggests that we are dangerously likely to mislead ourselves if we don't go by properly quantified and evaluated science.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of validity in what you're saying there, Alistair. I would note in passing that even if these interesting and surprising and encouraging facts about UK biodiversity are right, there's still been a major drop in insects over the last generation. It's just that that there was an increase before that. Look, in terms of biodiversity, it's something which is very important to be clear about. And I think you allowed this in your remarks, but I want to bring it out explicitly. Is that it's one thing to talk about the mass of insects, and it's another thing to talk about the variety of insects. And something which I think is pretty clear is happening around the world is a kind of gigantic simplification is going on, which is extremely dangerous. Again, it's unprecautionate, it's reckless. A monoculturization, and we're not a monoculturization, at least a massive simplification, such that it may be that in some places you're getting certain species doing really well, and which are quite adaptable and generalistic, or sometimes, of course, they're invasive species. What you're getting is a hollowing out and a fragilization of a whole load of ecosystems. And let's be very clear that the biodiversity COPs are showing a very, very worrying pattern, which they are absolutely clear about, and I'm sure you'll be the first to admit that, Alistair.
Indeed.
In specific reference to coronavirus, it seems pretty clear that the main culprits here are biodiversity destruction and cruel treatment of animals. It's not so clear that climate change is a culprit, although it may well be. And I note that Jem Bendell gives some peer-reviewed sources which suggest that it could well be in his blog that you criticized. What is very clear is that climate science is clear that the trajectory that we're on is increasing in general terms the likelihood of worse pandemics. And what is also very clear is that the kind of biodiversity loss and damage that we've been having is massively dangerous in all sorts of ways, irrespective of its hits on climate. In other words, we're sometimes inclined to overstate the importance of climate in these discussions, where actually the more obvious point to make is that the elimination of habitats and the great simplification that I'm describing is sort of undeniably a bad thing. And I sometimes wonder whether the reason we discuss climate so much is because there's a teeny bit more wiggle room for people to argue over it. Whereas when you're talking about, the number of football fields worth of forest in the Amazon that are being destroyed all the time, it's just completely obvious that there is absolutely no excuse for that and no no upside to that. And I suspect we might agree about that, Alistair.
Yes, very much so. And you know, again, the issue here is attribution. To what do we attribute things? And the wider reason, the wider reason why I suggest that going by the consensus expert reviewed science is that we do need a sense of timescales, and we do need a sense of where we need to act. And therefore,
can I press you on something, Alistair? What about my point that if you're talking about societal collapse,
if you're talking about
it's not clear that societal collapse, then it's not clear that it's enough to look at climate scientists alone. Surely one needs to look at a far broader range of disciplines, and one needs to listen to people like Joseph Tainter, for example, who've actually studied the collapse of complex societies in some detail. I would be much more inclined to trust Joseph Tainter's judgment as to whether we're on a path to collapse than the judgment of some common or garden climate scientists.
Yes, sorry, I didn't quite. My hearing is poor. Did you say social collapse, Rupert?
Yes, social collapse.
Yep. Well, indeed. I mean, the coronavirus is going to be a very good case study in that, and I suspect we'll see marked differences between rich countries and poor countries. One thing that I would point out is that you've often made the point about food vulnerability on food supply.
Yeah.
Very good point. At the same time, so often we frame these things in terms of what can go wrong, but we don't look at what can go right. So, being here in, I think my wife has disappeared from off the screen now, so I can show you. Yeah, being here in Scotland, I have a vested interest in our national product. And I thought to myself last night, okay, how much barley? Because you drive through Scotland and there's fields and fields of barley, just as you drive through France or Spain and it's full of vineyards. If that agricultural capacity was put over to food, what difference would it make? And you know what I found out? I found out that about 1.9 million tons of grain is produced for malt in Scotland every year. And that's about, all of that goes into the alcohol industry, basically, if it's for malt. 55% of it is for whiskies. When you work it out, in Scotland, and we grow, most of our own malt is grown for the whiskey industry. In Scotland, we produce the equivalent in malt for whiskey for what we eat in bread. We eat about 0.5 kilogram per person of bread per day. That'll include wastage, of course. And so immediately I see an area of resilience there, because if push came to shove, instead of keeping the distilleries going, we barley produced bread. It wouldn't taste very nice because it's the wrong kind of barley, but it's perfectly edible. We would eat that instead. Same with animal feedstuffs. And so my point is that there is more resilience than we need, than we might think. And we have to be careful of frightening people unnecessarily, because we may frighten them into the wrong actions. Yeah. But I wonder, could we move from that, Rupert?
Could I just respond to that? Could I respond to that? Yeah. So, because I really like the example, and yeah, there is plenty of buffering and contingency in our system that we might not immediately be aware of or notice, and that's encouraging. But I would underscore that the fact is, nevertheless, that in this country at the moment, we produce only half of the food that we eat. And that's an enormous gap. That's an enormous amount of space to be filled, as it were. And people have done calculations about this. For example, Simon Fairley did a wonderful rough calculation, but a calculation. I mean, it's disturbing that more people haven't done the calculation. About what we would need to do in order to be able to feed ourselves in this country. By this country, I mean the UK. And what he came up with is basically you'd need to do the kind of thing you just mentioned, Alistair, across the whole country. And you would need to have most people eating vegan most of the time. And you would need to more or less eliminate food waste. And that if you did all of those things, it's just about the case that we'd be able to feed ourselves in a year where the crop yields are normal. Now think about that. What that implies is that actually we don't have any buffering at all. Because if what happens in the next few years is the kind of thing that happened a couple of years ago, and yields start to massively reduce because of a massive heat wave, then we have no buffering. And then we are dependent on other countries to avoid starvation. And right now in the world, because of the corona crisis, some countries, including some quite major countries, have stopped exports of staple foods. So I say that when I raise this worry, I'm not unnecessarily scaring people. I'm drawing attention to a very real danger that we in this country are in. I think there's a lot of complacency here because we think, well, we're a developed country and a rich country. We're going to be fine. It's Bangladesh and Nigeria and so on that have got the most to worry about. And yeah, it's true they've got the most to worry about. But we are fooling ourselves if we think we've got nothing to worry about.
Okay, thank you, Rupert. Very shortly, Laura is going to kick you and I off here so that we can have
yes.
participant interaction. Can I really just get to one key question on the activism front, Rupert, which is that recently you produced a paper on, it's called Rushing the Emergency, Rushing the Rebellion. And obviously you're speaking not as XR in it, I think you say, but you are nevertheless a spokesperson for XR. And you have some very honest critique of the movement in there. You critique the idea of 3.5% of the population on the streets bringing about change. You say that YouGov polling conducted by XR shows that public support has fallen to just 5%, which is down, I think, about 30 points from what its peak was. You say that donations are down. Recently, a £250,000 appeal was launched by XR to keep things going, that social media interactions are down. And you say, and I quote here, that it leads us to conclude that XR is already approaching terminal fatigue with its existing methods. You then go on to propose a number of other approaches, particularly focused around vulnerability, including blockading supermarket depots, and you've talked about this in some of your videos. You since said to me, of course, that the coronavirus kind of makes that one redundant. But the question that I would like to put to you, Rupert, and it's a question that first came up very strongly in my mind after 9/11, when I watched those planes flying into the towers. And I thought to myself, you know, the kind of activism we have done in the past is not going to be understood in the same way in the future. And I think that we need to shift to different forms, I would say more spiritually based, more community forming, community building based forms of engagement. But could I put it to you, in terms of the obstructive as distinct from the constructive program, to use Gandhi's distinction, how do you see the future of the radical edge of the activist movement, given the wonderfully frank points that you've made in this appraisal here?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating space to open up, and it'll be fascinating to see what people on this call have to say about that as well. And I'm already wondering if we might want to go on a bit past 6:30 because this is such rich territory. Look, I totally agree with you about the importance of spiritually based activism. If it hadn't been for the coronavirus, I was going to be teaching a course on it at Schumacher next month. As it is, I'll be doing an Earth talk at Schumacher on May the 13th, which people might want to come to by Zoom, and the actual course will be next year. I think that XR has been quite rich itself in that area, and indeed some of that is reflected in our pamphlet, Rushing the Rebellion, that you kindly mentioned. Do I think that all activism from now on has to be like that, or that all activism has to be community-based? No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think it's very clear that exactly a year ago, the April Rebellion that XR had was hugely successful, and it wasn't like that, mostly. Hugely successful in changing opinions in this country and really moving the dial, moving the Overton window. In Rushing the Rebellion, we argue, myself and my co-authors argue, that the October Rebellion was too much like a sort of repeat of the April Rebellion. And what we need to do is move on to forms of activism, which would include the stuff you're talking about, Alistair, but also include stuff that was targeted against, if you will, some of the main culprits, although in a loving way, in a distinctively XR way, not saying we're targeting the rich because we hate the rich and we want to eat the rich or whatever, but we're targeting the rich because there just isn't any future in which there are multiple private jets. And so for the sake of everybody, including even the children of the rich, we have to have a more equal future and so forth. And yeah, we mentioned the possibility of doing stuff to highlight the nature of the vulnerabilities in our just-in-time food system. And as you say, that's sort of been rendered irrelevant now, it seems, by coronavirus. I think a lot of people are getting that. But I think there's still stuff like that should be done going forward. I'm interested, for example, in activism which would be targeted at the insurance industry, because the insurance industry is a fascinating case, because they actually have a lot of information about our vulnerabilities. They monetize our vulnerabilities. They are vulnerable themselves to the worsening climate disasters which are coming. That's just an example of the kind of activism which I think wouldn't just fit within the kind that you're talking about, Alistair, which I think we should be open to as the world starts to open up again from this fascinating, horrible, wonderful period of coronavirus lockdown.
Okay, maybe I can just not reply to that if you don't mind, and pass back to Laura now. So we've got half an hour for discussion.
We have half an hour for discussion, and we have about 10 excellent questions. I'll be speaking the questions because playing search for the face will be impossible. Our first question is a request to define science, and this is directed at both Alistair and Rupert from Marcus and all of us.
Request to...
Would you please define science?
Define science.
Yeah. So shall I start with that as the philosopher of science? So as I've mentioned in the chat, I've written a lot about this, although what I've written may not be satisfying to the request for a definition, because I don't think that a very useful Socratic type definition can be given. As Liam said, there's lots of things which don't get defined, which can be perfectly well explored. Very roughly, what I mean by science is activities like physics. And some of you will think that's a completely unsatisfactory definition. But I think we all actually know science when we see it, and it's stuff relevantly like that. And I agree with Marcus in his point in the chat, that actually it would be best for us not to include under the definition of science stuff which is not enough like physics. A lot of what goes on in universities today is basically engineering or technology rather than science. And the reason why it's worth making that distinction is because although I've already argued that it's unwise for us to be victims of the ideology of science, I think it's even more unwise for us to have the attitude of thinking that any technology that gets developed should be implemented. And here I'm with, for example, Hannah Arendt, who says technology ought to be the servant of society rather than society be the servant of technology. And that's a radical view to have in our world today. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why we're in such terrible trouble is because it's seen as a radical view. And because so many people think that if the technology gets invented, we have to implement it. And because technologists continually try to wrap themselves in the clothing of science, because they want to inherit the good name and the good reputation of science a little more than they're entitled to do.
I would say that science is the process of making observations about reality and then testing those observations, including the framing in our own minds within which we are holding them. And I don't think I've got anything else to add to what Rupert has said.
You were much more succinct than me. Well done.
Thank you.
Because you'd covered plenty of it,
okay, fine.
so I don't need to duplicate.
Very well. I have my little timer set here for 3 minutes per response, just so that we can get to everybody, and hopefully not at an expense of wisdom. Our next question is from Deepak, who has asked, could you clarify where you stand? This is for Alistair. Could you clarify where you stand on Guy McPherson's well-documented position that he quotes and relies heavily on peer review? Does that question...
Could I clarify, sorry, by hearing again? Look.
Guy McPherson's well-documented position.
Whose position? Who's well-documented?
Right. Okay, let's go to another question if you'd like. Or Rupert, would you like to address that question as well? It's more specific than the others. It was one of the first I recorded.
I wonder if we might unmute Deepak and let him say exactly what he means, because I'm a bit surprised by his question. Is that possible?
I am searching for him. There you are. I see you. Please, Deepak, please.
Thank you. So, Alistair, Rupert, it's really the idea that when challenged, Guy McPherson says that he doesn't...
Guy McPherson, yes.
Says he doesn't put anything out into the public space unless it's underpinned with peer-reviewed science. Now, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I'll start on that. I think that's absolute nonsense. I think that Guy McPherson is a dangerous fantasist. He's made predictions in the past about when the world was going to come to an end. They've been proved false. He's doing it again. They'll be proved false again. As far as I'm concerned, he's a cult leader. He's also been incredibly nasty to a number of us in Extinction Rebellion. He's an egotist. He should be ignored. Let's move on.
Yeah. So Guy McPherson, he's the guy who predicts a human extinction by 2026. He's quite adamant about that.
He's come forward. He says it's 2023 now, I think.
Yeah, I think he moved it forward. I mean, goodness knows. So, basically he's into all of this kind of stuff like, the methane bomb going off and so on. If you look at the science around a methane bomb, methane is increasing, but it's not coming the Arctic. The isotope studies show that it's mainly, or suggest that you have to be so careful with scientific language. To say show implies certainty. To say suggest allows uncertainty. The isotope studies suggest that it's coming mainly from the tropics and from fracking, from the oil and gas industry. The more gas you produce, the more leakage of methane that you get. But McPherson is using this to drive a kind of, you go onto his website and he's got suicide warning up, and then it links you through to a guy who web-blogged his own suicide. He's saying, I don't recommend suicide, but, it can be a rational option. So I really think you've got the elements of a death cult there. But it raises a wider question. Guy McPherson raises a wider question as to the propensity in all of us today in this secular world to seek the spiritual, to seek the relationship with death and seeing through death in ways that can take on a cultic or a millenarian, a kind of end of the world, a new order coming about manner. And this is part of why I think we have to be so careful that we stick closely to the science. Because otherwise, we may have ideas put up in our minds that can lead us into delusional senses of reality that exploit and hijack the eminently appropriate spiritual thirst to go deeper and to tackle the underlying problems of our time. I think Rupert and I, we agreed on the phone the other day, didn't we, Rupert, that we're only really going to tackle this if we tackle deep drivers in the human condition that drive the level of consumerism that we get onto, that in turn, combined with population, drives CO2 emissions. And so, tackling the software and not just the hardware is so pivotal to this.
I totally agree, and your work is very beautiful on this aspect of things, tackling the root causes, Alistair. Just a couple of points of slight disagreement with what you've just said, though. While I stand by what I just said about McPherson, I would also say that I think that there are some indications emerging that we are getting more methane release around the Arctic. And again, this is a classic example where we ought to apply the precautionary principle. If there's any evidence at all that that's happening, it ought to really terrify us and ought to be a very strong reason for us to push much harder to reduce emissions, etc., much faster. Also, just on the question of the tendency towards a kind of religious attitude, I guess I would make the kind of provocative remark that I think that scientism functions in a quasi-religious way in our society. And I wonder if you yourself, Alistair, might occasionally be overly venerating this golden calf.
I could well be, Rupert, but I don't want to go deeply into that because back to Laura, but I could well be. I mean, we all have our blind spots, and that is the point of this kind of dialogue.
Can I just confirm that? So I'm really happy to hear both those responses on Macpherson. That's really reassuring. I think one of the big things is he gives himself away through that tremendous attack defense behavior.
Yeah.
And I think if you're relying on the science, you don't need to do that. But what I was really getting at was really, Alistair, whether you'd done any probing into his quotes of peer-reviewed science and whether there was any validity in that.
Well, with Macpherson stuff, it was so wacky, it was so off the wall. It's largely based on methane and collapse of the food system that I've looked a lot into the methane stuff. The book that I've got coming out in the autumn, Riders on a Storm, Climate Change and the Survival of Being. In that book, which I've been working on over the past 6 months, I've looked a lot at climate change alarmism. There's a full chapter on it. And I didn't so much look at Macpherson because he's so much off the wall. Yeah. I looked more at Roger Hallam, Jem Bendel's type of stuff, which is much more mainstream, but which also relies on things like the methane bomb going off. And then I looked at the scientific stuff. I looked at what the Ipcc said about that and what leading scientists like Gavin Schmidt at NASA, Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe, all of them people expert in atmospheric science had to say, and they all basically say it's off the wall. The kind of Shakova stuff, Shakova, Semelitov et al., their work, the Russian team's work on methane plumes in the Arctic. The Ipcc does give them house space. It cites one paper, but in the overall mix of it, there is heavily conflicting information. There are other teams at the Ipcc sites who say that they have greatly exaggerated because they are looking at too narrow a focus. And the Ipcc's bottom line on it all is we actually just, and Rupert will say here we need the precautionary principle, but the Ipcc basically says we don't know enough about what is normal, what the background is in Arctic science, to be able to say what is abnormal. The best we can do just now are things like the isotope studies of where it's coming from in the atmosphere. And what we can say at the moment is that it's mostly not coming from the Arctic. And what's more, a number of leading Arctic scientists would say that things like the methane clathrates and so on going off, that is unlikely in the near to medium term future likely to happen. It could happen if the planet gets far more hotter still, but in the near to medium term future, they don't see it as being a big issue. And therefore, when it's used to ramp up, and please don't come back to me on this because we do need to press on, but when it's used to ramp up climate alarmism, the question is whether it's doing so, whether it's leading people down the wrong path, and whether we should be sticking to the more mainstream science, which is quite alarming enough.
But can I come back just quickly on that, Laura?
We have to...
Just very quickly.
We have hit... Oh, Rupert, yes, okay. And
just
this is actually answering other people's questions. I'm seeing other...
Okay, good,
I hope that everyone's seeing this happen. So please, yes.
So I do worry about Alistair's use of the term alarmism. I do worry about who's caught in that dragnet. Guy Macpherson is obviously an alarmist. I suppose I would say that one or two of the things that my amazing colleague Roger Hallam has said have been alarmist, insofar as they've been couched as predictions rather than scenarios. But in general terms, it doesn't seem to me that there's any significant amount of alarmism in Extinction Rebellion. What we're doing is raising the alarm. And this, of course, is the key distinction that Winston Churchill famously made between being an alarmist, which is a bad thing, and raising the alarm, which is a good thing. And it's very intriguing that Winston Churchill was repeatedly called an alarmist in the 1930s, just as over the last couple of months, lots of people who the government didn't like, etc., were called alarmists around COVID-19. And now it's self-evident that the precautionary argument that myself and Taleb and others were making around COVID-19 was absolutely correct, and that the government's complacent response was catastrophic. So I think we need to be very, very cautious about using this term alarmist as a term of criticism. I think we should restrict it to people who are clearly going beyond the bounds of what's reasonable. Otherwise, you're in danger of lumping in people who are trying to be precautious, like myself, and trying to protect us with people who are clearly dangerous, like Macpherson.
Thank you. Another question is, and that one sort of blanketed about 3 of them. So I'm playing DJ in this nightclub of the mind. One question is, so, pardon me, these are really, really good. From Sarah, science is fairly dry and doesn't engage people's emotions. We need human stories to engage emotions. Do we need to engage people's emotions in order for them to act?
That's a good one. Shall I start on that, Alistair?
Go for it.
So my answer is yes. And I think it's clear that this is one of the ways that XR has done well. That XR has deliberately sought to mobilize people's emotions. Now, of course, and Alistair will no doubt say this, that you've got to be very careful about that. And of course, you do have to be careful about that. You know, you can think of getting a crowd worked up in the kind of way that a sort of hysterical or dictatorial speaker can get a crowd worked up. It's not about that. But it's about mobilizing people's emotions. And first and foremost, it's about allowing people's emotions and allowing a space for them. And the argument we would make is that in traditional environmental activism, that wasn't done very much. And people were repeatedly told, no, you need to remain calm. You need to always sound rational. You need to stick to calm, rational policy advice. And essentially, a lot of environmental activism until recently was a form of sort of organized policy wonkery, which was never going to appeal to a large swathe of people, and wasn't going to liberate the power that comes from emotionality, because we are emotional beings. We have these emotions for a reason. So what XR has done is allowed people a space to express their grief and to express their fears. And to express their hopes as well, and to mobilize all of those, and all of those, of course, really come in the end from love. Love is why, for example, you grieve, because you're heartbroken by the things that you're losing. And the XR case is only if those emotions get mobilized is it even conceivable that we're going to step up to the plate and do enough. And so, you know, there's no contradiction here with science. You know, there's of course the role for the calmness of the scientific enterprise and the Ipcc enterprise and so on. But I would add that there is, I think, also a very powerful role for scientists to get emotional as well, and that has its own power. And there's an incongruency if scientists are always very calm when they present these pictures of how terrible everything is and so on, because I think that people read that calmness and they think, well, he's telling me that you know, things are really grim ecosystemically and so on and so forth, but he doesn't seem very upset about it, so maybe it can't really be that bad. So I think that even for scientists, there's a powerful place for emotion. So yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, and if I can just hold this gentleman up, Patrick Geddes, who is a great Scottish Victorian thinker, and you know, he talked about the 3 H's: head, hand, and heart. The importance of having all of these 3 in harmony. So I agree with everything you've said there, Rupert, and I think this is one of the things that XR, and also Greta, for all her coolness, Greta Thunberg also, there's a kind of calm, very deep emotion behind that, have brought into it. That and you see particularly with Greta Thunberg's work, she's obviously well advised on the science, and her more recent statements especially have tended to stick quite closely to particularly the science of Special Report 1.5 degrees warming. That what you see going on there is a harmony of the head in terms of thinking things through and sticking with the science, the heart in terms of the feeling, the emotion that motivates action and connects us in with one another in community, which is another important thing of environmental movements, the community that they build, and the hand, the actual getting out and doing it in whatever realm the activism in our life might lie.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Our next question engages thinkers outside of science, such as citizen scientists and also the indigenous communities. Can you please speak to them? I believe these questions came in quite early, Alistair, as you were addressing the to whom should we be listening? And several people
to whom should we be
question.
As I was addressing to whom?
Sorry about that. What about citizen scientists and indigenous science?
Okay. So, I mean, much of my work has been with indigenous people, whether in Melanesia or in, I gradually woke up to the fact that being raised on the Isle of Lewis, we have indigenous people here too. And again, just a slight word of caution. So, I vividly remember the first time climate change became a thing for me was in 1985 when I was financial advisor to the South Pacific Appropriate Technology Foundation in Papua New Guinea. And Andrew Carolini, our director, came back from a conference in Tuvalu. And, we could see the way he walked into the office that something was wrong. And he sat down at his desk and we said, "What's up, Andrew?" And he said, if what we have just been told, in time to come, Tuvalu will be no more. Now, the Ipcc actually has a case study on Tuvalu as a case of misattribution. Because what's actually been coming out in Tuvalu is that the land has been rising because tectonic uplift is going faster than the sea level is going down. And so, you've got the climate change deniers are all piling onto Tuvalu just now, saying that it's a case of what they call wishful sinking, that they wish it was still sinking, that they get funds for climate change, whereas in fact, according to some studies, it's coming up. So we have to be very careful about going to any one location and looking at what's happening. In Riders in the Storm, I start off taking a group from West Papua. This was last year. I took a group from West Papua of village leaders to my home village of Lurbost in the Isle of Lewis, where we could visibly see the rate at which the sea level is rising and eating into the agricultural land and exposing prehistoric pine forest underneath. And you kind of say to them, look, yes, there's a number of things happening here. There's evidence of increased wave action. So when there's a storm, you get more erosion. There is evidence that the sea level is rising by 3.6 millimeters per annum at present, and therefore the sea level is coming up. But also, there is evidence that on the island, you have got local subsidence, that because of tectonic readjustment after the Ice Age, the centre of Scotland got pushed down and is now coming up, but the edges got tilted up and are now going back down, if I might simplify horribly. And therefore, that is exacerbating the rate of what we are seeing. So simply to go and spot case studies, as is inevitably the case with place-based indigenous people, is important for those communities, but we have to be careful that we don't generalize to the whole world from those individual place-based case studies.
Yeah, maybe I could just add to that I think maybe the question I had in mind, the importance of indigenous wisdom and indigenous understanding of some of the fundamental things that we're talking about.
Yeah,
and I do think those are very important. And also...
I did, he said. So I'm sorry, my hearing is poor. I missed the nuance, so maybe you could fill in on that one, Rupert.
Yeah. So I think we've got a lot to learn from indigenous societies and indeed also from extant peasant societies. as to how we can reorient ourselves in the years ahead if we're going to avoid collapse, or indeed if we are going to collapse, and how we can survive that as best as possible. And I just want to recommend one fascinating book here, which I'll put in the chat, which is The Future Eaters by Flannery, who basically deals with the paradox that on the one hand, the forebears of our indigenous cultures decimated most of the world's megafauna outside Africa. But on the other hand, most of the extant indigenous cultures we know seem to live in a remarkable harmony with their societies, with their ecosystems. And, you know, that's something we can learn from them and admire in them. And he tries to think about how to reconcile these two things. And basically the solution he suggests is that those cultures which decimated their megafauna, etc., they either learned from that, either quickly or over a long period of time, or they didn't make it. And the dilemma that we have is that if we don't learn now from indigenous societies and so forth, we're going to collapse things far more completely than any previous collapse, because we have a globalized society. So it's quite a powerful way, I think, of thinking of the stakes and of thinking of the importance of learning from that history and of learning from the inspirational models we can find today in many indigenous cultures.
So Laura, may I quickly come back on that and answer the question properly? My hearing is I have hearing aids, folks, and I miss things sometimes, but I didn't answer it quite rightly. You know, the reason that my wife and I have been working with a number of groups from West Papua province and Papua province and the Indonesian side of New Guinea in recent years is that when they come to Scotland, what we're trying to do is to give them a vision of what community empowerment can look like. So, you know, the work for which I'm best known is work with land reform in Scotland. We now have nearly 3% of Scotland's land back into community tenure. There's over 400 groups owning bits of their own land scattered around Scotland now. And 2/3 of the Western Isles, where I was raised, are now in community land tenure. And what's going on there is that indigenous wisdom is being reactivated. And when we have visitors from other countries come to see what is happening here in Scotland, it amazes them, because indigenous meets indigenous. And they see that, you know, yes, we can do it, that when people are given control of the place in which they live, when you've got control of your own land, held as a community by democratically accountable structures, you then don't have to pay a speculator to buy land for housing so the young can carry on living there. You can then use renewable energy to finance the community. You can set up community businesses, and then there's a whole psychological and spiritual confidence it means. So, you know, we feed that back into other parts of the world from here in Scotland when we go to places like Egg or Harris or Lewis. And then the beautiful thing in the case of working with Melanesians is I'm able to say to them, and by the way, folks, have a look at these pictures, because it was in the 4 years that I spent in Papua New Guinea as a VSO volunteer that Melanesian people, indigenous people who I lived amongst, taught me these ways of connection to the land. And I realized, hang on, we had it here in Scotland too, and we need to reactivate that. And every time I speak now in England, Rupert, I say to people, you need to wake up to the enclosures. You need to wake up to the harrying of the North. Wake up to your own history, and then you will understand from whom you need to take back control.
That's beautifully put. I just want to share another quick book recommendation, if I may. I'm reading right now Paul Kingsnorth's book, The Wake. And it's fiction, but it's quite closely based in historical fact. It's an account. Many of you know Paul Kingsnorth, one of the inspirations of the Dark Mountain movement, who of course have been proving quite prescient. It's a book about the post 1066 England, and about the collapse of English culture as it was experienced by the invasion of the French, because, you know, that's what happens. our so-called first king, William the Conqueror, was of course a Norman. He wasn't English at all.
A Norseman, Frenchified. Yeah, colonized the French first.
Well, yeah, okay, it's more complex than I just made out even. But to put it in simple terms, he wasn't English. And for 3 centuries after that, the kings of England did not speak English. And Paul Kingsnorth has an amazing way of taking you right into that. And I'm finding it an incredibly powerful experience actually reading his book.
Thank you. I'm going to combine 3 questions in one here because they do connect. I'm synthesizing as I go. From Graham, can the general public in the West, reared on expectations of meals from McDonald's, plastic crap and cheap flights to Spain, etc., can they understand the complexity of existential threats? And from John, a comment question. In Ireland, we have a saying about the famine: Providence sent the potato blight, but the English caused the famine. So a contemporary version might be: global capitalism caused the virus, but national capitalisms brought the pandemic. Going back to Graham's question, if so, how do we use COVID-19 to get people on board? And this ties in with the end of John's question, and all of this ties in with Ian's question too. I don't think we've heard anyone talk about capitalism. So there we go.
Ouch.
3
Capitalism.
questions in one, everyone. That's an editor at work right there.
Yeah, what a great set of questions. I'll make a start with the question about well, a sort of a paraphrase of the question would be something like: are people too thick to be able to make the changes we need to make in the face of existential threats? And I think the answer is no. And the reason is that, yeah, people may not be well placed to do that if you simply give them a question in an opinion poll, or for that matter, an option in a ballot box. But the beauty of the citizens' assembly method, the deliberative democracy method, is it gives everyone a chance to get into things more deeply. So whether or not someone is a denizen of McDonald's, if you give them a chance to think about something for a long period of time, and actually the citizens' assemblies we need would be running for longer than the current one we've got in the UK, which is really just dipping toes into the pond. If you give people a chance to think about things for a long time and to deliberate for a long time and to really be exposed to expert information, to a broad range of experts to be the basis of that deliberation, I think there's a great deal of hope that they can come up with great answers. So I think that our existing pseudo-democracy is inadequate in a consumerist society to really face existential threats adequately. That's why we need citizens' assemblies.
Laura, did I hear that somebody asked about capitalism?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So maybe if I could tune in on that particular aspect, because one of the things that I explore in Riders in the Storm is the question of what do we mean by capitalism? That I think we have to be careful when we objectify a problem onto whether we call it capitalism or the system or whatever. And we forget that in systems theory understanding, we are actually all parts of the system that in turn shapes us. And so at one level, I see capitalism very much a driver of things like COVID-19, insofar as it is the intensification of the pace of activity on Earth. It is our high level of interconnectivity, our communications, the fact we can travel and carry a virus with us. All of that is made possible in large measure by the kind of capitalist system that we have got. The slight problem is that simply to point the finger at the governments and the corporations for allowing that overlooks the fact that we are also part of it, that the system we deplore is in part an emergent property of ourselves. Now, you might say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, you know, I'm somebody who has never in my life earned anything like near average national salary, just the kind of work I have done. But for about 5 years in my life, I had a small pension that is now worth, or it was worth, about 50,000. That's a total pot. In other words, it would give me a pension if I ever retire of just over £1,000 a year. That's the pension that I've got stashed aside for my work. Where is that invested? It is, of course, invested in the money markets. Okay, when I took it out, I insisted they put it into Friends Provident, what was then the Quaker Ethical Fund, but it's now owned by Aviva. And frankly, folks, I've no idea where it is now, because the capitalist system has kind of absorbed it all. Nevertheless, I have to own the fact. I have to own the fact that I am part complicit. When I go shopping for things, I generally shop around for a good deal. What am I doing when I do that? The emergent consequence of that is that I am driving the competitive system. I'm being part of the competitive system in when I do that. So in so many ways, we have to acknowledge that it's not just the 1% that are doing it to us, but we are also creating a situation that makes that happen. What is the antidote to that? Well, the antidote, that's why I'm so passionate about land reform, community empowerment, community organizations. We pay double for our milk because we get it delivered in a bottle from a cooperative that does it to the farm, that kind of thing. At the same time, be careful, even what I've just said about the milk, I'm living here in Govan in Glasgow, which is a hard-pressed part. I'm surrounded by poverty where we live here. We live in a nice house, but in a poor area. And most families wouldn't be able to afford to pay double for their milk in order to do justice to the farmers. So we have to be quite careful that we don't virtue signal in these kind of things, while at the same time working to try and build community structures by which people can be held in a fabric with one another. And if anything comes out of this coronavirus, what I'm seeing just now that gives me hope is the degree to which there is a lot of community collaboration going on. People are reconnecting locally in communities to look out for one another, to help one another. The forecasts that if something like this happened, a disaster movie scenario, that we would all be out fighting each other, so far hasn't come true. We're seeing quite the opposite of people really caring for each other. And that's my hope of what we will learn from the virus that would be transferable over to how we address climate change.
Yeah, so I just want to come back on that. I completely agree with Alistair's last point there. That's absolutely vital. And I'll put something in the chat to follow that up with. I want to take slight issue with what he said earlier, though. Of course, there's a clear sense in which what Alistair said about our own, we're all kind of responsible, we're all part of the system, etc., is true. Of course, there are often always things we can do about that. Of course, many of us should do more. But the line that we take on this in Extinction Rebellion, which I think is basically right, is, look, the problem is fundamentally a systemic problem. And the danger if you overemphasize those kinds of questions of what people can do as individuals and responsibility we should all take about our pensions and so on and so forth, is that you make people feel guilty, and you get them focusing on small things, usually, that they can do by themselves, rather than getting them to join up in exactly the kind of community, or indeed at a larger societal level, that Alistair wants them to join up in. And that's why we say in Extinction Rebellion that the fundamental issue is an issue of systemic change. And we don't want to get distracted from that by talking too much about, should we be vegan or not? Is it unacceptable ever to fly? Do you have to make sure that your pension is ethical? Those kind of conversations actually are the conversations that our opponents want us to get bogged down in. And quite often, if I'm on the media defending Extinction Rebellion, if it's an aggressive, hard right talk show host or something, those will be the kind of things they try to focus on, because they think that's a kind of Achilles heel. Now, of course, one way of dealing with that is to make sure that you're absolutely ethically unblemished. But even if you are, it's still actually, at the end of the day, a sort of a distraction to be spending all the time talking about that. rather than the systemic changes we need to make that that are embedded in our three demands.
And one final reflection is there were several questions and comments about the role of imagination and creativity, story and narrative in the chat while we were going on. And I feel we've talked about emotion. I feel that we'd be remiss if we didn't address the role of these other forms of knowledge, as one asker phrased it. The role of imagination, spirit, and creativity. Rupert and Alistair, what are your reflections on this?
His name has just escaped me. Could somebody, Rupert, remind me? Martin Shaw, the English mythologist, storyteller. You know, a day before yesterday, I was doing Thought for the Day, the God slot on Radio Scotland. And I knew that I had to talk something, I knew I had to say something about the loneliness of people locked up, especially old people and so on. I just felt that's where I had to go. But I couldn't get it where to go. And then one of my was on here, if he's still there, Todd Levasseur in South Carolina. He sent me a link to Martin Shaw's latest video in which Martin starts off, he's being interviewed by somebody in Canada, and he starts off telling this story. If you wanted to harm somebody, you would crawl into their tent and you would close the smoke hole. You'd close the flap over the smoke hole. It says my internet connection is unstable. Are you hearing me okay, Laura? You're hearing me, okay. Laura, wave to me if you can't hear me and I'll repeat it. It's my internet connection is quite poor just now. You'd crawl into that tent and you'd close the flap over the smoke hole so that God couldn't see what it was that you did to them. And you know, that story just opened up the whole thought for me, because the question is, when people are in lockdown, when people are experiencing severe isolation and loneliness in some cases, what can we do in community with one another to open one another's smoke holes so that people are not hurt more than needs to be the case? What can we do, like sending a card, a phone call, all of that kind of thing? How can we continue to build community? And just the way that little story it kind of went mad in my mind. It just opened up, and that's the role of imagination. That imagination, likewise, we see it with community land ownership. That when communities hold their own land, you'd just be amazed the way that imagination comes out and opens up things that are for both the individual and the common good. So I think of something like the folks on Egg who started their own microbrewery, and it's their own business, but everybody benefits from it, all of that kind of stuff. So imagination is crucial. And in this time of lockdown, pursuing practices, spiritual practices, creative practices that open up our connection to that deep imagination and what Allen Ginsberg called the starry dynamo of the universe, the fiery dynamo of the universe, that kind of thing. Opening up connection to that, that's kind of where we can most deeply go in these times.
Well, what can I add to that? I think that was beautifully put, and it's lovely to end on a note of profound agreement. I guess I'll just say a couple of things to sort of embroider on that. One is that I do profoundly believe that that this time is a time where it's possible and important to do really important work, imagining what a better future could be. I think that those of us who are not on the front line are being given an extraordinary opportunity to pause here. It's a spiritual opportunity, among other things, and we absolutely mustn't waste it. And I would urge anyone who wants to follow this up to read my 24 Theses on Corona, which I've put into the chat a couple of times, which are my effort to do some of this imagination. It's a remarkably positive piece. People accuse me sometimes of being negative or even alarmist. But I think anyone reading that piece will see that I'm also someone who could very much accentuate the positive. And the second and final thing I want to say is that the reason, that the ultimate reason I think this is such an extraordinary time to be able to imagine different is because the imagination is enormously helped by what is actually happening. By what is actually happening, this incredible upsurge of mutual aid, the amazing way in which many peoples are moving ahead of their governments, as we did so powerfully in this country. We've had confirmation of that today in the Daily Telegraph, with a cabinet minister saying to a Telegraph journalist, we didn't want to do the lockdown. It was people moving ahead of us and already going into isolation and cancelling their events and putting pressure on us that made the lockdown come about. The way that we've grounded most of the planes, the way that we protectively contracted the whole economy, don't let them call it a recession. It's a protective contraction. We've protected the vulnerable by contracting the economy. There's a whole swathe of list of things. The enormous falls in air pollution and many others that you're familiar with. The imagination is enormously helped because we can see parts of a different world right now in what we're doing, in what we're hearing, in what we're seeing on the media, etc. And of course, in things like the clap for the NHS, which I don't know about you, but perhaps you're too isolated for this, Alistair, I don't know, but my experience on the first night of the clap for the NHS, I went to the door, and perhaps many people had the same feeling. I went to the door thinking, is anyone else going to be there? Maybe it's just going to be me, and it's going to be so crap if it's just me. I went to the door and I opened it, and half of my street were there, and it was such a fantastic feeling of kind of togetherness and, a different and more caring world really is possible. So it's a great time to imagine a better future, because parts of that better future are visible already right now.
Well, we are at 1:45 over here in the United States, and we are at 6:45 over where you are. I think this has been a wonderful conversation, Rupert and Alistair. What a gift to all of us. I am in the process right now of copying all the links. Yes, the sign language apology, applause. Yes, not apology, applause. I'm in the process of going through the links that were pasted in the chats. A lot of information was going back and forth. So I will save that. I'm just about to post my email address to everyone. And so if you would like that, please jot this down and email me. And I'm not going to tidy it up because it's chaotic, and that's where creativity dwells sometimes. So you'll just receive it as I've been copying and pasting there. I've sent it to everyone. So just send me an email and I'll send you what I can of the chat.
And Laura, will you send this in any case to me and Alistair, and maybe we can share it a little bit too?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
I'm trying to save all the chat. So Alistair and Josie, if you could not close out the meeting until after I'm finished.
You saved it. And folks, I will be posting the Twitter, not Twitter, but Zoom takes sometimes a few hours to process video. But basically, this is being hosted on a Glasgow University site, and it'll be available for the next year. I will be posting the link on Twitter later on. I'll also put it on my website. If you Google my name, you'll find that. I'm sure Rupert and Laura will circulate it too. I'm not on Facebook, so I can't put it on that, but other people will. So this will be available for viewing later. And I would just like to say thank you to Rupert for his for having suggested this conversation. And I'm sure, Rupert, we're both frustrated at what we didn't have time to say, but grateful for what we were able to say.
Yeah.
And a huge thanks to all of you for coming here, to Josie for patrolling the Zoom bombs. How was it for you, Josie, in that challenging role?
It was a little bit more stressful in the beginning, but it was fine.
Welcome, Josie and Laura.
And Laura, I think everybody will see why when we realized it would be helpful to have a host, why I asked Laura if she might again oblige, because she does this with such grace. So, thank you, folks, from me. And
Tracy is suggesting we should have a follow-up sometime, Alistair.
I'm sure we can do that at some point if they can tolerate any more of us, Rupert. And what's so good about this, Rupert, is that there are significant points on which we disagree, not all of which we're able to get to, but we can talk about these things. And the ecology of where we're at just now is one where there's inevitably going to be diversity. We all test things out and test our own belief systems and what have you. It's great. I love it.
Great. All right. Everybody.
So could I suggest that Josie, Rupert, Laura, and myself, we just stay on and just have a wee chat amongst ourselves. I would love to have said hello to there's people like John Barry there in Ireland. I would love to have said hello to you and your various other old friends been appearing in, but Kate, hello there, and so many of you, but we're just not able to do that in this format. But it's been lovely talking to you. So, folks, if you'd like to close your screens now and gradually check out, and just allow us a little bit of private space. So, farewell, as T.S. Eliot puts it. Not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers.
Yes.
We keep going. Not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers.
Very good.